The small village of St. Aldhelms, nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, had never been known for excitement. Its cobbled streets, lined with thatched cottages and the occasional ivy-clad manor, were usually the scene of gentle domesticity. The baker's bread rising on Monday mornings, the vicar's mild admonitions in the parish newsletter, and the elderly ladies gossiping by the post office window with all the authority of seasoned judges. Yet on one particularly crisp December afternoon, the village was poised for its yearly spectacle, the St. Aldhelms Christmas Pageant, a tradition that drew every family, neighbour, and stray visitor willing to bundle against the cold. Miss Marple, sitting comfortably in her favourite armchair at Cherry Tree Cottage, carefully knitting a red scarf, had received her invitation with a polite note delivered by the postman. She usually observed these village gatherings from a distance, her sharp eyes absorbing every mannerism, a gesture, and whispered remark. Nothing quite like watching people try to behave properly when they'd rather do otherwise, she murmured to herself, adjusting her spectacles. The town hall had been festively decorated with evergreens, holly, and tinsel that sparkled under the soft glow of gas lamps. The scent of pine mingled with the warm aroma of mince pies and roasting chestnuts, promising a cozy evening. Children, cheeks pink with excitement and cold, darted about in makeshift angel costumes, shepherd garb, and robes that smelled faintly of mothballs. Parents fussed over misplaced wings or crooked crowns, the air alive with gentle chaos. Miss Marple arrived shortly before the pageant was due to begin, greeting familiar faces with her customary blend of warmth and curiosity. There was Mrs. Pettigrew, the baker's wife, fussing over the angel costumes, muttering about how children today had no sense of responsibility. Reverend Collins moved through the crowd with an air of mild exasperation, checking that the nativity script was followed to the letter. And then there was Miss Larkspur, a retired governess with sharp eyes and a penchant for sniffing out minor indiscretions, hovering at the edge of the hall like a hawk surveying its prey. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perhaps almost too normal. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of weak tea, made a small mental note of the various tensions in the room. The Thompsons, a newly arrived family, appeared nervously out of place, glancing at the established villagers as though silently measuring their social worth. Young Simon Hargreaves, a mischievous boy with a knack for causing trouble, had already lost one of his sheep's costume ears and was now pleading with his mother to let it stay like this. Everyone will forget. The pageant began with a flourish of music from the village orchestra, a slightly off-key but earnest ensemble composed mostly of amateurs. Children recited their lines with varying degrees of clarity, while parents nodded approvingly from the back rows. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. She had seen countless village pageants, each one a delicate microcosm of human nature. Pride, embarrassment, petty rivalry, and occasionally outright deceit, all disguised beneath holiday cheer. It was during the third tableau, the scene depicting the arrival of the Magi, that the first unusual note crept into the evening. A sudden silence fell over the hall as though someone had flicked a switch. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, her sharp gaze moving from face to face. A hush that was not prompted by the play itself, a pause pregnant with tension. At first, she thought it was merely a child forgetting a line, a natural part of such productions. But then, a low gasp from the audience caught her attention. Turning her eyes toward the stage, Miss Marple's heart sank ever so slightly. There, at the foot of the manger, lay Mr. Eustace Fairchild, a man well known in the village for his cantankerous manners and endless criticisms of local events, slumped unnaturally, his eyes wide and unseeing. Panic erupted. Children screamed, some crying, while parents rushed forward in frantic confusion. Reverend Collins attempted to maintain order, but his voice trembled as he called for someone to fetch the doctor. Miss Marple, however, did not move at once. She studied the scene with the calm precision of a hawk observing a nest. The crowd parted around her as she knelt beside the motionless man, noting the subtle details others overlooked, the faint smell of almonds, the peculiar angle of Mr. Fairchild's hand, and a small folded piece of paper clutched tightly in his fingers. "It seems," Miss Marple said softly, her voice barely carrying over the commotion, "that poor Mr. Fairchild has met with something far more alarming than a lost line in a pageant." The doctor arrived moments later and, after a quick examination, shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid he's dead," he announced, and a wave of shock rippled through the hall. Whispers began immediately. Heart attack, accident, poison. Children clung to their parents' skirts, wide-eyed, while grown-ups tried to piece together explanations that made any sense. Miss Marple, however, remained quiet. She allowed the hysteria to swell around her, knowing from long experience that truth often hid in plain sight, while panic clouded the minds of the crowd. She noticed the nervous shifting of feet, the glances exchanged, the faintly guilty expressions that some adults could not entirely suppress. Something about this death felt deliberate, she realized. An act, not a misfortune, and her mind began its subtle, methodical work. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, blanketing St. Aldhelm's in white. Inside, the pageant, which had promised only festive cheer, had become a stage for far darker human emotions. And from her quiet corner, Miss Marple, ever attentive, was already beginning to untangle the threads of suspicion, hidden grudges, and small betrayals that had led to this sudden and shocking silence. The Christmas pageant had gone silent indeed, but the mystery, Miss Marple knew, was just beginning. By the time the ambulance had carried Mr. Eustace Fairchild's body away, the village hall had transformed from a scene of festive cheer to one of muted chaos. Mothers clutched their sobbing children, while fathers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to offer comfort or stand frozen in shock. Conversation, where it existed at all, was punctuated by nervous whispers and speculative murmurs that traveled faster than any snowflake drifting outside. Mrs. Pettigrew, the baker's wife, was the first to articulate the sentiment of the room. "Oh, whatever shall we do?" she wailed, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "A man dead in the middle of our Christmas pageant. Why, it's simply unheard of." She looked to the others as though reassurance was a communal responsibility, yet no one seemed capable of providing it. Miss Marple observed quietly from her usual vantage at the back of the hall. She noted that the panic was unevenly distributed. The Thompsons, new to St. Aldhelm's, appeared both horrified and strangely calculating, whispering to one another in low tones, their eyes scanning the crowd with careful attention. It was not grief, Miss Marple recognized. It was strategy, a measured assessment of social placement in the wake of a scandal. Reverend Collins, pale and flustered, tried to restore order. "Let us all remain calm," he said, his voice quivering despite the authority he wished to convey. "This is a matter for the police, and I'm certain they will attend promptly. In the meantime, I suggest everyone take a seat and try to compose themselves." Seats, of course, were impossible to find, and villagers leaned against walls or clutched door frames, murmuring their theories. The pageant, which only moments ago had been a celebration of goodwill and nativity cheer, now seemed an absurd backdrop to human folly. Young Simon Hargreaves, who had caused a minor costume disaster earlier, sat slumped on a bench, his sheep ears drooping, muttering, "It wasn't my fault." The adults ignored him, absorbed in speculation, though Miss Marple made a mental note of the boy's defensiveness. Children, she knew, often saw more than adults presumed. Gossip, as Miss Marple anticipated, blossomed rapidly. Mrs. Larkspur, who prided herself on her ability to unearth any minor impropriety, leaned toward Mrs. Pettigrew. "Do you suppose it could have been the Christmas pudding? Poisoned, perhaps? Or some accident with the lights?" she whispered, her eyes wide, though not with fear. Curiosity, barely masked as propriety, twinkled in them. Across the hall, Mr. Harris, the local grocer, shook his head vehemently. Nonsense. Eustace Fairchild was a fit man for his age. I'll bet my life it was foul play. There are plenty here with grudges. You don't think he was liked much, do you? His comment elicited a chorus of nods and murmurs. Indeed, Mr. Fairchild had long been known for his sharp tongue and unforgiving opinions, often criticizing the pageant, the villagers' homes, and even the vicar's sermons. Miss Marple listened patiently, noting patterns of response. Some villagers displayed immediate shock, others restrained excitement beneath a veneer of politeness, and a few, a small minority, exhibited a curious detachment. Detachment, she knew, was often the mask of guilt. She observed Mrs. Bellamy, for instance, a woman usually loud in her social commentary, sitting in silence with her hands tightly clasped, her eyes flicking toward the stage as if measuring something unseen. The discussion turned to speculation about motive. Perhaps he angered someone with one of his criticisms, Mrs. Pettigrew suggested. He did make life difficult for many of us, you know. Oh, everyone has grudges, Mrs. Larkspur added with relish. But do we really think someone would go this far? To kill? People surprise you, Miss Marple murmured under her breath, almost to herself. She had learned long ago that the seeds of crime often lay in petty grievances, minor jealousies, and long-buried resentments. At that moment, Sergeant Miller, the local constable, arrived, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and mild exasperation. I need everyone to remain calm, he said, clipboard in hand. We'll need statements from witnesses, and we must cordon off the area. No one leaves until we have taken notes. Instantly, a murmur of discontent rose from the crowd. The villagers, usually compliant, now hesitated. Mrs. Pettigrew protested, but the children, my grandchildren, are frightened. Surely we may take them home. Sergeant Miller gave a tight nod. We'll see to that, but everyone else, please remain here. It's for your own safety. Miss Marple, as ever, remained unobtrusive. While the constable tried to establish order, she began to notice subtle interactions among the villagers. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes shifted repeatedly toward the stage. Young Simon Hargreaves avoided looking at anyone's face, and the Thompsons whispered frequently, occasionally glancing at the vicar as if weighing his response for future advantage. Each detail, small though it was, added to a mental tapestry that Miss Marple would later examine in full. By the time the first police car arrived, summoned from the nearby town of Dunley, the hall was buzzing with a mix of fear, curiosity, and outright speculation. Villagers leaned toward one another in conspiratorial clusters, exchanging observations and half-formed theories. One small group suggested that the pageant props might have been tampered with. Another insisted it was a heart attack brought on by excitement. The tension was almost tangible, a living thing, stretching every nerve in the room taut. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her now lukewarm tea, reflected on human behavior as she had so often done in the past. The outward expressions, the cries, the protests, the whispered theories, were all distractions. Beneath them she sensed currents of hidden resentment, personal ambition, and carefully disguised malice. Somewhere among these familiar faces, she knew, lay a truth no one yet suspected. And while the villagers argued, gestured, and speculated, Miss Marple's mind began the quiet work of untangling the web. Every word, every glance, every gesture could be a clue, if only one knew how to observe it. And in St. Aldhelm's that snowy evening, Miss Marple already suspected that appearances were deceiving. The peace of the village, she knew, had always been a fragile illusion. The pageant was over, but the true drama, Miss Marple realized, had only just begun. The following morning, St. Aldhelm's was cloaked in a quiet unease, as though the very village had been held in suspense overnight. Snow still dusted the cobbled streets, and the chimneys puffed gentle spirals of smoke into the pale winter sky. Life, it seemed, was attempting to resume its ordinary rhythm, yet an invisible tension hung in the air. The memory of Mr. Eustace Fairchild, lying lifeless at the Christmas pageant, had left its indelible mark. Miss Marple, as was her habit, rose early. She brewed a pot of tea, glanced out her window at the frost-laced garden, and considered the events of the previous evening. To the casual observer, the pageant's tragedy might appear straightforward. A man had died, a doctor had been called, and the authorities would see to the rest. Yet she had learned, over decades of watching human behavior, that the simplest explanations were rarely the correct ones. There were patterns here, and patterns revealed motives. She donned her scarf and coat and set out for the village, her steps quiet on the snow-dusted path. The first stop was the village hall, still cordoned off by police tape. Sergeant Miller, looking more harried than usual, greeted her with a nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. I don't suppose you slept much?" he asked. "Not particularly," she replied mildly. Curiosity has a way of keeping one awake. She moved past him toward the hall, careful not to disturb any official proceedings. "I thought I might observe how the villagers are adjusting to the aftermath." Inside, the hall was empty of children but still held traces of the previous night. A fallen angel wing, a shepherd's crook leaning crookedly against a wall, and faint footprints in the sawdust scattered across the floor. Sergeant Miller was taking statements from Mrs. Pettigrew, who had insisted on describing every detail of the evening, her words punctuated with theatrical gasps. Miss Marple's attention, however, drifted elsewhere. She noticed subtle inconsistencies in the villagers' demeanor. Mrs. Larkspur, for instance, had volunteered information with eager precision, yet her eyes occasionally darted toward the hall's corners as if she expected someone to be listening. The Thompsons were quiet, their expressions carefully neutral, though Miss Marple's keen eye caught the tension in their hands, tightly clasped to conceal their nerves. Even young Simon Hargreaves, despite being absent, would later be the subject of her careful inquiry. Children, she knew, often absorbed more than adults realized, and his small mischiefs might offer unexpected insight. By mid-morning, the local constable began organizing villagers for questioning. "We need to reconstruct the evening as precisely as possible," Sergeant Miller explained. "Any detail, no matter how minor, could be important." Miss Marple moved among the villagers, listening with gentle attentiveness, careful to appear more interested in social pleasantries than in the details of the crime. She asked Mrs. Pettigrew after her third description of Simon's misbehavior, "Did you notice whether Mr. Fairchild seemed particularly agitated at any point?" "Oh, yes, Mrs. Pettigrew said eagerly. "He was fussing about the costumes, but I didn't think much of it. He's always like that, isn't he?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though inside she noted the precise wording. "Always like that" was often a clue. When a man was unusually composed, it was considered normal. When he was unusually critical, it might indicate irritation or concealment of anxiety. She filed the observation away. Reverend Collins arrived shortly, hands trembling as he adjusted his spectacles. "The children are fine," he said, his voice tight. "Though naturally, some are distressed. Parents will need to soothe them. But I must say, Miss Marple, it is all so bewildering. I cannot imagine who would wish Mr. Fairchild harm." "That is precisely why we must observe quietly," Miss Marple replied softly. "There is often a motive that escapes immediate notice, hidden in the everyday patterns of life." After brief greetings and polite exchanges, she turned her attention to the scene of the incident itself. Though the body had been removed, she examined the footprints, the scuffed stage edges, and the faint traces of fabric caught on the wooden floorboards. A small folded piece of paper lay abandoned under a bench, likely dropped in the commotion. Miss Marple pocketed it discreetly, knowing that such minor details, easily overlooked, often revealed more than the grand gestures of a suspect. By late morning, word had spread that the village hall had been reopened for community use, though the air remained tense. Groups of villagers gathered in clusters, whispering theories that ranged from heart attack to deliberate poison. Mrs. Pettigrew insisted it was the pudding, Mrs. Larkspur suggested a secret vendetta, and Mr. Harris leaned toward a financial motive. Miss Marple noted how each theory reflected the speaker's own preoccupations and biases. A baker imagined food, a gossipy retired governess imagined revenge, and a practical grocer imagined money. The mind of the observer, she thought, often revealed as much as that of the observed. She then visited the Fairchild residence, a modest yet tidy cottage near the village green. Mrs. Fairchild, a small, prim woman with an anxious expression, greeted her at the door. I don't know what to make of it, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands. "Eustace had no enemies, not that I know of. How could someone—" She broke off, her voice faltering. "Sometimes, my dear, people hide resentment behind polite smiles," Miss Marple said gently. She observed Mrs. Fairchild's surroundings, the neat lace curtains, the array of family portraits, the faint scent of lavender masking a hint of worry. Every detail suggested a woman accustomed to control, yet now struggling against the sudden intrusion of disorder. Next, Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, where she carefully unfolded the piece of paper she had picked up at the hall. It was nothing more than a fragment of printed text, a note from the pageant committee, though the handwriting in pencil at the margin, barely legible, caught her attention. A single word, written slantwise, almost hidden. Tonight. Even without full context, Miss Marple sensed the significance. It was not evidence, not in the legal sense, but it was a trace of human intention, a whisper of premeditation that might otherwise have escaped notice. She made a note to observe the reactions of villagers to seemingly insignificant questions. Often, guilt revealed itself in the most ordinary manner. By afternoon, the village buzzed with cautious curiosity. Visitors, drawn by news of the tragedy, whispered at the edges of the green, while the local shopkeepers observed behavior with heightened awareness. Miss Marple, strolling discreetly through the town, noted the subtle avoidance of eye contact by certain individuals, the careful phrasing of answers, and the nervous adjustment of gloves or collars. Each tiny detail was a thread in a tapestry that, when pulled correctly, would reveal the hidden pattern of human behavior. And so, the early investigation continued, not with dramatic interrogations or forensic displays, but with the quiet, precise work that Miss Marple excelled at. She listened, she observed, and above all, she waited, knowing that in a village such as St. Aldhelm's, the truth, though buried beneath layers of custom, habit, and fear, would eventually reveal itself to the patient and perceptive eye. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the village once more, and Miss Marple, seated by her window that evening with another cup of tea, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Patterns were forming, motives aligning, and while the villagers speculated in frantic whispers, she knew that the first steps toward uncovering the truth had already been taken. By the second day after Mr. Eustace Fairchild's sudden death, St. Aldhelm's was buzzing with speculation, yet a pall of unease lingered over the village. At the village hall, Sergeant Miller had begun his formal investigation in earnest, and already a name had begun to circulate. Simon Hargreaves, the mischievous young boy who had been performing as a shepherd in the Christmas pageant. The townsfolk whispered that Simon had been flustered during the pageant, fidgeting with his costume and causing minor disruptions, and some insisted that he had been near Mr. Fairchild at the time of the collapse. Miss Marple observed these accusations quietly. She had long ago learned that the obvious suspect was rarely the true culprit, and children, in particular, were convenient scapegoats. Yet she did not dismiss the possibility entirely. Careful observation required patience and detail. She had seen Simon earlier that morning, seated by the schoolyard wall with his head bowed and hands stuffed into his pockets, avoiding eye contact with passers-by. There was nervousness, yes, but it did not necessarily indicate guilt. The first villagers to confront Simon were the local teachers, Mrs. Pritchard and Miss Walton. "Now, Simon," Mrs. Pritchard said, her voice stern. "We need to know exactly what happened last night. Tell us everything." The boy's eyes flickered between them, wide and uncertain. I didn't do anything," he stammered. I was helping the other children. I didn't—" "Calm yourself, child," Miss Marple interjected softly, appearing beside him as though she had merely wandered by. "Sometimes the truth has a way of revealing itself if we observe carefully, rather than worry excessively." Simon looked up, startled, and a small flicker of trust passed across his face. Meanwhile, the adult suspects were emerging in greater detail. Among them, the most talked-about figure was Mrs. Bellamy, a wealthy widow whose sharp tongue had made her a fixture in village gossip for decades. Some villagers recalled that she had quarreled with Mr. Fairchild over seating arrangements at last year's Christmas pageant and over the village committee's allocation of funds for decorations. Her icy demeanor and carefully maintained appearance gave her an aura of authority and, in the eyes of some, the motive for malice. At the village hall that morning, Miss Marple noted Mrs. Bellamy's every gesture, the flick of her gloved hand, the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth, the way she tilted her head when listening to the constable's questions. She spoke with measured civility, answering queries with calm precision, yet Miss Marple detected the subtle signs of impatience beneath her composed exterior. A hand that twitched when denied attention, a slight flush at an unwelcome remark. These were hints, but not proof. Mr. Harris, the grocer, soon became another focus of suspicion. Villagers murmured that he had argued with Mr. Fairchild over deliveries and financial matters. Some claimed that Mr. Fairchild had been critical of his business, and that grudges sometimes lingered far longer than politeness suggested. When Miss Marple observed him, he seemed genuinely perplexed, though his eyes occasionally darted to the hall doorway as if measuring who might be watching. He was nervous, yes, but was it guilt or merely concern for the disruption to village life? Even the Thompsons, still newcomers to St. Aldhelm's, had attracted attention. Their cautious behavior and whispered conversations had not gone unnoticed, and some villagers were quick to imply that outsiders often harbored secrets. Miss Marple, however, did not read their calm restraint as guilt. Instead, she catalogued their gestures. The way Mr. Thompson adjusted his cufflinks when questioned, the slight hesitation in Mrs. Thompson's replies, the way both avoided long eye contact with anyone. Small, seemingly insignificant details, but in her mind, each had meaning. Throughout the day, the constable gathered statements, some detailed, others fragmentary. Villagers repeated their observations from the previous night, adding commentary, conjecture, and opinion. "He wasn't liked by half the village," one man said. "I'd not be surprised if someone—" "Stop!" exclaimed another. "We mustn't accuse without proof." Miss Marple moved among the groups, listening carefully. She asked indirect questions. Did anyone notice whether Mr. Fairchild had been speaking particularly sharply? Or did the children behave unusually at any point? Her queries seemed innocent, almost incidental, yet they revealed subtle patterns in the villagers' stories. Some accounts were consistent, others conflicted. Some witnesses hesitated, others were eager to assert a theory. By mid-afternoon, a particularly vocal theory began to dominate the village gossip, that Mr. Fairchild's death had been caused by some action during the pageant itself, perhaps a misstep or accident involving one of the children. The adults leaned toward explanations that implicated the young participants, while the children themselves whispered among each other, fearful of blame. Miss Marple observed Simon once more, noticing the boy's nervous fidgeting and the slight, guilty-looking curl of his lips when accused. Yet she saw no malice in his eyes, only confusion and fear. The scene in the hall grew tense as Sergeant Miller, frustrated by the conflicting statements, insisted that everyone remain calm. "We will find out what happened," he said firmly. "But I urge restraint. No wild accusations, please." The villagers nodded, though whispers continued in low, conspiratorial tones. Miss Marple, in her quiet corner, reflected on the unfolding scenario. The obvious suspects, Simon Hargreaves, Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Harris, were all plausible in the eyes of the villagers, yet she remained unconvinced. Each person exhibited telltale signs. Yes, but human behavior, she knew, could be misleading. Nervousness, impatience, and subtle gestures were not proof of guilt. They were merely clues waiting to be interpreted correctly. A minor, almost imperceptible detail caught her attention: the placement of Mr. Fairchild's chair the previous night. It had been moved slightly off its usual spot on the stage, as if someone had anticipated the unfolding events. The change had gone unnoticed by everyone except her. She filed the observation away. Small details, Miss Marple knew, often held the key to larger truths. By evening, the first suspects had been formally noted by Sergeant Miller, and the village had collectively formed a mental list of likely culprits. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her tea at Cherry Tree Cottage later that night, smiled faintly. She understood that the first suspects were rarely the true ones. The patterns of human behavior she had observed, the minor inconsistencies and the subtle gestures suggested a different story. A story that would unfold gradually, revealing hidden motives, concealed resentments, and perhaps even deliberate deception. The villagers slept uneasily that night, troubled by whispers, speculation, and fear. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, catalogued each behavior, each expression, and each fragment of conversation with quiet patience. The first suspects were only the beginning. The truth, she knew, lay deeper, buried beneath politeness, propriety, and the careful facades that people maintained in a small village. And so, as the snow fell softly over St. Aldhelms, the stage was set for a deeper investigation. The obvious suspects were in place, their motives hypothesized, their behavior scrutinized. But Miss Marple, ever composed and quietly relentless, already sensed that the real story was hidden elsewhere, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The morning after the first suspects had been noted, St. Aldhelms settled into a deceptively quiet routine. Snow still clung to the eaves of cottages and weighed heavily upon the bare branches of the village green. But the villagers' minds were far from peaceful. Conversation, once light and trivial, now revolved entirely around Mr. Eustace Fairchild's death. Even routine errands were punctuated by cautious speculation. Who had done it, and why? Miss Marple, as always, approached the day with careful observation rather than idle conjecture. She set out from Cherry Tree Cottage, scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, her gloved hands tucked inside the pockets of her coat. Her first stop was the village hall, where Sergeant Miller was continuing his collection of statements and observations from villagers who had been present at the pageant. The hall itself retained an air of disordered familiarity. A shepherd's crook still leaned at a slight angle, a faint streak of sawdust marked the edge of the stage, and a torn angel wing rested forgotten under a bench. The previous evening's panic had left subtle traces that most people overlooked entirely. Miss Marple, however, noticed everything: the faint scuff marks, the slight imbalance in the stage decorations, the way the pine needles from the Christmas trees had been displaced. These details, trivial though they seemed, could form a map of human behavior and movement, should one know how to interpret them. Her attention was drawn to a small wooden box on a table near the back of the hall. It had been set aside the night before and, until now, had escaped the notice of police and villagers alike. Miss Marple bent to examine it more closely. The box, no larger than a shoebox, was slightly ajar. Inside, carefully folded, was a collection of envelopes and scraps of paper, nothing unusual for a pageant committee, except for a particular envelope, slightly crumpled and marked in faint pencil with the word "Tonight." She recognized it immediately. It was the note she had pocketed the previous day at the stage. But now, with closer inspection, she observed a tiny smudge at the edge of the word, as if someone had handled it in haste. The smudge was not random. It bore the subtle outline of a fingerprint. Miss Marple, with her years of attentive observation, knew that fingerprints were not always the sole province of forensic experts. Even in this small, unremarkable village, human behavior left traces that could be interpreted. Someone had touched this envelope deliberately, perhaps trying to conceal its significance. Curiosity prompted her to move further along the table. A second envelope lay beneath it, unmarked, yet it contained a single handwritten word. Gift. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Gift. Tonight. What a peculiar coincidence, she murmured, her mind tracing possible connections between the messages and the events of the pageant. She rose and turned to survey the hall again. Her eyes fell upon the stage edge, where a small pile of costume scraps had been left. One piece, a fragment of fabric, appeared slightly singed at the corner. Miss Marple's heart gave a quiet leap of recognition. The burn was minor, too minor to be immediately dangerous, but it suggested the presence of something flammable in the vicinity. Something had been placed intentionally, yet the cause of the fire had been avoided, overlooked by everyone in the commotion of the pageant. As she considered the combination of the envelope, the pencil mark, and the burned fabric, Miss Marple began to form a tentative theory. The clues were subtle, almost invisible, yet they all suggested preparation and deliberate intent. The pageant had not simply been the site of a natural death. Someone had used it as a stage for their purpose, and the details were left precisely where the observant eye could find them. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Larkspur, who swept into the hall with her usual air of sharp curiosity. "I hear you've been examining the scene, Miss Marple," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Do you really think there is anything left to discover? The police have already identified the suspects, haven't they?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Observations are rarely exhausted, Mrs. Larkspur. One may be able to form a theory, but without careful scrutiny, many details remain hidden." She indicated the envelopes and the burn mark with a delicate gesture. Sometimes the smallest detail, unnoticed by others, carries the heaviest meaning. Mrs. Larkspur peered at the box, her eyes narrowing. "I see only papers and scraps. Surely this is nothing of consequence?" "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied softly. "The note, the envelope, and even the burn, each tells a story about human behavior, about intention, and sometimes intention is the key to understanding motive." After Mrs. Larkspur had departed, Miss Marple examined the envelopes again. The handwriting on the second note, "Gift," was hurried and almost childish in style, yet deliberate. A person of deliberate calculation would not use a script so uneven unless attempting to disguise their hand. She noted the contrast with the pencil smudge on the first envelope. Two distinct touches, two subtle signals of involvement, both overlooked by everyone else. Miss Marple rose, pocketing the envelopes once more. Her next step would be to observe the villagers' reactions to questions about these trivial details, to watch for hesitation, for involuntary gestures, for a flicker of recognition or unease. She understood that guilt, in small communities, rarely spoke aloud. It revealed itself in nervous glances, in sudden stiffness of posture, in subtle signs that only a trained eye could detect. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in the weak winter sunlight, creating slushy paths along the village lanes. Miss Marple paused at the window of the hall and looked down at the streets. Villagers walked briskly, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering in tight clusters. Every gesture was a potential clue, every avoidance or misstep a fragment of truth. The hidden clue she had discovered, tiny, almost insignificant, yet pregnant with meaning, was the first step toward untangling the web of events that had led to Mr. Fairchild's death. Miss Marple, quietly and patiently, began to map these observations in her mind, connecting the pencil marks, the folded notes, and the singed fabric with the patterns of behavior she had witnessed in the villagers. By evening, she returned to Cherry Tree Cottage, her mind alive with possibility. The envelopes rested on the table before her, alongside her notebook filled with observations. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Many would overlook these details, dismissing them as trivial. Yet she understood that in the smallest signs, the largest truths were often hidden. The first suspects, the village gossip, and the official statements were all pieces of a puzzle. But this hidden clue, subtle, delicate, and almost invisible, was the thread that, when followed, might unravel the entire mystery. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes reflecting the quiet determination of someone who had already begun to see the outline of the solution. And somewhere, in St. Aldhelm's, the true culprit moved among the villagers, confident that their secret was safe. Yet Miss Marple knew differently. The smallest detail, unnoticed by all but her, had already begun to expose the carefully constructed facade. The stage was set and the threads were in motion. Only patience, careful observation, and an understanding of human nature would reveal the full truth. The morning air in St. Aldhelm's was crisp and biting, carrying with it the faint scent of pine from the village green. Yet the chill in the air did not compare to the tension that had settled over the town. Rumors swirled like the snowflakes that clung to the rooftops, and every glance, every conversation, now seemed fraught with hidden meaning. Miss Marple, ever observant, moved quietly among the villagers, noting subtle signs, a clenched fist here, a quivering lip there, a sudden shift of weight that betrayed discomfort or guilt. Her first visit was to Mrs. Bellamy, the wealthy widow whose reputation for sharp wit and sharper tongue had made her a frequent subject of speculation. Mrs. Bellamy received her in the drawing-room, which gleamed with polished wood and carefully arranged ornaments. "Miss Marple, do come in," she said, her voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I suppose you are here to question me about poor Eustace." "Merely to observe, Mrs. Bellamy," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat in the corner without disturbing a single item. "I'm interested in understanding how events affect people and how people affect events." Mrs. Bellamy's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what have you observed so far?" "Human nature," Miss Marple said softly. "It is seldom as transparent as it seems. Some people wear politeness as a mask, while others allow a small gesture to betray their true feelings. Even the most carefully constructed facade can falter under scrutiny." Mrs. Bellamy's hand tightened around the edge of her teacup. "I assure you, I had no quarrel with Mr. Fairchild beyond the trivial disagreements any villagers might have. Surely you don't imagine I could—" She paused, a faint flush creeping into her cheeks, and Miss Marple noted it. Subtle, easily missed, yet telling. "I do not make assumptions, Mrs. Bellamy," Miss Marple said, watching the flicker of hesitation. "I merely notice patterns. Sometimes past grievances reveal themselves when the present turns unexpectedly tense." From there, Miss Marple's attention turned to Mr. Harris, the grocer, who had been implicated in whispered accusations regarding financial disputes with the deceased. She arrived at his shop mid-morning, noting the careful arrangement of goods and the habitual orderliness that suggested a mind inclined toward control. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," Mr. Harris said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I trust you are not going to add to the village gossip." "On the contrary," she replied. "I am merely interested in your perspective. Did Mr. Fairchild ever express dissatisfaction with your business?" "Yes, occasionally," he admitted, "but nothing serious. Just minor complaints like any customer might have." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, though he could be a persistent man when he wanted something. Miss Marple inclined her head. Persistence could be interpreted in many ways: insistence, irritation, or resentment. She catalogued his words carefully. Then she asked casually, "Did anything unusual happen during the pageant? Anything that might seem insignificant but struck you as odd?" Mr. Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing I can recall, really. Just the usual bustle and excitement." Subtlety, she realized, was crucial. People often concealed their secrets through understatement or by declaring minor oddities as trivial. Next, Miss Marple sought out the Thompsons, who had arrived recently in St. Aldhelms and already attracted suspicion due to their quiet demeanor and whispered conversations. She found Mrs. Thompson in the parlor of their small but tidy house, sitting with hands folded in her lap. "Miss Marple," she said, inclining her head politely, "I hope you do not suspect us. We are hardly acquainted with the village yet." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, "I am curious. When one is new to a community, one observes more carefully. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual during the pageant?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated. I suppose the placement of Mr. Fairchild's chair was different. It was slightly off-center, and I thought it peculiar at the time. But I assumed it was accidental." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not all accidents are accidental, Mrs. Thompson, and sometimes what seems a trivial detail is the thread that unravels the rest of the tapestry." By noon, Miss Marple had gathered more subtle information than Sergeant Miller could have achieved in days. Each visit, each casual conversation, revealed layers beneath the polished surfaces of the villagers' facades. She noted how Mrs. Pettigrew's hands trembled slightly when recounting her observations of Simon Hargreaves, how Mr. Harris avoided glancing toward the hall when discussing Mr. Fairchild, and how Mrs. Bellamy's lips pressed together ever so briefly whenever the subject of old grievances arose. Yet the most revealing moment came in the late afternoon, during an informal gathering at the village green. Miss Marple had encouraged several villagers to speak casually about the pageant, allowing them to believe she was simply indulging in idle conversation. "You know," Mrs. Larkspur began, "it is curious how one remembers some details and forgets others. I, for example, noticed that someone had moved a chair during the pageant. Most would not have thought it worth mentioning." Miss Marple's eyes brightened subtly. Yes, movement and placement often reveal more than the casual observer realizes. Objects, like people, can indicate intent. The murmuring villagers exchanged glances, some frowning in thought. A hush fell briefly over the group as they considered her words. Small gestures were significant after all: a tilt of the head, a twitch of the hand, a pause in speech. Miss Marple had begun to detect the threads of motive woven among their daily lives. Later, in the quiet of Cherry Tree Cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the day's findings. Each villager, she realized, harbored secrets: small, personal grievances, hidden ambitions, or past transgressions long buried. And yet, not all of them were guilty of the act that had ended Mr. Fairchild's life. Determining which secrets were merely human and which concealed intent was the delicate task she now faced. The hidden clue she had discovered in the hall, the pencil-marked envelope, the folded note, the singed fabric, had already begun to intersect with these revelations. Human behavior, Miss Marple mused, often left subtle marks that could not be faked. Nervous glances, careful avoidance, and over-precision in speech were all telling, even if ignored by less discerning eyes. She sipped her tea and considered her next steps. The villagers would continue to gossip. The police would continue their inquiries, but it was her quiet, patient observation that would reveal the tangled web of motive. Each revelation of personal history, each admission of past resentment, each subtle, nervous gesture would ultimately point her toward the truth. By evening, a soft snow began to fall once more over St. Aldhelms, covering footprints, concealing tracks, and providing the village with a deceptive sense of calm. But Miss Marple knew differently. Beneath the ordinary surface of civility lay a complicated network of relationships, grievances, and ambitions. Some secrets were trivial, some dangerous, and one, or perhaps more, would prove deadly. And so, with the night falling, Miss Marple prepared for the next stage of her investigation. Confrontations and confessions, both subtle and overt, would gradually expose the deeper motives and hidden resentments that had led to Mr. Fairchild's death. Each villager's secret was a thread, and she intended to unravel them carefully, one by one, until the entire truth was revealed. The morning of the 7th day following the ill-fated Christmas pageant began with a peculiar stillness. St. Aldhelms, which had been brimming with whispers and speculation, seemed quieter now, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Snow had melted from the main streets, leaving patches of muddy slush, yet the tension lingered. Villagers moved with cautious steps, exchanging furtive glances, while Miss Marple, as always, observed from her discreet vantage points. The first hint of complication came unexpectedly. A message was delivered to Sergeant Miller. A bundle of letters, sealed and marked with no sender's name, had appeared on his desk at the station. The envelopes were peculiar, carefully folded, identical in size, and each containing fragments of correspondence that suggested long-forgotten grievances. Miss Marple, having been summoned to view them, picked one up delicately. It was addressed to Mr. Fairchild in faint, meticulous handwriting, though the ink was slightly smeared, as if handled in haste. "What do you make of them, Miss Marple?" asked Sergeant Miller, his brow furrowed. "It seems someone has been sending these secretly. Could they relate to the murder?" Miss Marple studied the letters, noticing subtle patterns. "The words are carefully chosen," she murmured. "There is grievance here, yes, but also an attempt to hide something. The sender wished to communicate without revealing themselves. That choice alone tells us something about their state of mind." By late morning, the village hall had once again become the center of activity. Rumors that Mr. Fairchild had received anonymous threats had spread like wildfire. Villagers exchanged stories, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated. Mrs. Pettigrew claimed she had overheard a mysterious conversation during the pageant rehearsals, while Mr. Harris insisted he had seen a stranger lurking near the stage. Miss Marple, however, remained unmoved by these reports. She had learned long ago that hysteria often colored observation. Instead, she focused on subtle discrepancies. The way Mrs. Bellamy avoided certain questions, the hesitation in Mr. Harris's voice when discussing deliveries, and Simon Hargreaves' nervous shuffling when adults referenced the pageant's final moments. It was Miss Larkspur, the retired governess, who inadvertently provided the most striking twist. She entered the hall mid-afternoon, visibly agitated, and whispered urgently to Sergeant Miller. There's something odd about the stage decorations. I noticed it when tidying the hall this morning. Some of the props, costumes, minor pieces of the set, have been moved. Not by accident, I think. By design." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Movement, intentional or not, could be extremely revealing. She walked to the stage, her gaze sweeping over the arrangement of props and furniture. Sure enough, she noticed slight misalignments. The shepherd's crook was not exactly in its usual position. A small angel wing had shifted, and the chair Mr. Fairchild had used was slightly closer to the edge of the stage than she recalled. These were not dramatic changes, yet they were deliberate enough to suggest human intervention. As she catalogued the minor disturbances, a small sound from the doorway caught her attention. It was Simon Hargreaves, nervously fidgeting with the edge of his scarf. "Miss Marple, he began, his voice barely audible. "Shh, Simon," she said gently. "You need not speak yet. Just observe what we see here." The boy's eyes widened. He had been present during rehearsals, aware of every movement, every misalignment, yet his small confession would come later. For now, Miss Marple focused on the broader pattern. Someone had deliberately altered the stage, subtly enough to be overlooked, yet visible to a discerning eye. Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Fairchild, who appeared unusually composed. "I thought I should see the hall," she said, voice quiet but controlled. "Perhaps it will help me understand what has happened." Miss Marple observed her carefully. The widow's demeanor was impeccable, yet there was a faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted the lace on her sleeve. "Some changes here," Miss Marple said casually, gesturing toward the stage. "Do you notice anything odd?" Mrs. Fairchild's gaze followed hers. A flash of recognition crossed her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Perhaps some minor adjustments," she replied. "Children can be careless with props." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, though inwardly she noted the subtle tension in Mrs. Fairchild's posture. Even the calmest of people often revealed themselves through involuntary movements. An eye twitch, a lip press, the brief clenching of hands. By mid-afternoon, another revelation arrived unexpectedly. Mrs. Larkspur had discovered a partially burned scrap of paper near the back of the hall. On it, in faint pencil, were the words, "Do not trust." Miss Marple examined the fragment closely. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it resonated with meaning. Someone had deliberately left a warning, a clue that perhaps even they did not fully understand themselves. This discovery shifted the village's atmosphere. Whispers intensified, suspicion moved fluidly from one individual to another, and the already fragile sense of security disintegrated further. The villagers were beginning to grasp that the murder was not a simple accident, nor was the solution obvious. Someone had orchestrated events with precision, masking their actions beneath layers of everyday life. Miss Marple, however, maintained her composure. While others speculated wildly, she catalogued the facts calmly. The minor changes on stage, the letters, and the warning note were threads, each connected to human behavior, intention, and timing. Her mind traced connections. Which villagers had access to the hall, who had been present during rehearsals, and whose knowledge might have enabled them to manipulate events subtly. Even Simon Hargreaves, though innocent, had become an inadvertent source of insight. His nervous gestures, slight stammer, and observation of the props provided context for the orchestrated adjustments. Miss Marple considered how someone might have used the boy's presence to their advantage, ensuring he remained a bystander while they executed their plan. By evening, the snow had begun again, dusting the village in quiet white. The new revelations, the letters, the moved props, the burned warning, had created a fresh layer of complexity. Miss Marple sipped her tea in Cherry Tree Cottage, reviewing her notes carefully. She understood that the culprit had not only acted deliberately, but had anticipated the reactions of others, leaving small, almost invisible breadcrumbs that revealed subtle intent. The twist, she realized, was this. The first suspects were only the beginning, and the true perpetrator had cleverly misdirected attention, using ordinary human behavior, minor alterations, and psychological manipulation to obscure the truth. The path forward required patience, acute observation, and a keen understanding of human nature, qualities Miss Marple possessed in abundance. As darkness fell over St. Aldhelms, she reflected on the day's discoveries. The puzzle had grown more intricate, yet the pieces were beginning to align. Every misaligned prop, every warning note, every nervous glance and fleeting gesture was a clue. And in her calm, composed mind, Miss Marple began to form a picture of a plan executed with subtle brilliance, a plan that only the patient and discerning eye could unravel. The village, for all its outward calm, had entered a delicate new phase. Suspicion shifted like the wind, secrets bubbled just beneath the surface, and the threads of motive had grown more entangled. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, understood that each new twist brought her closer to the truth. The game had changed, yet the rules remained the same. Observe, listen, and interpret. In the quiet of Cherry Tree Cottage, she smiled faintly, knowing that the true unraveling of the mystery had only just begun. A heavy silence hung over St. Mildred's Lane as evening fell, the frost silvering rooftops and window panes. Lamps flickered behind drawn curtains, and chimney smoke curled in thin, wavering streams. Yet despite the cold, no one lingered by their hearths with peace. The murder had settled into the bones of the village, unsettling the familiar rhythms of life. Neighbors eyed one another with guarded glances. Conversations lowered when footsteps approached. Even the church bells, normally bright and reassuring at dusk, seemed mournful tonight. Inspector Graves walked briskly through the snow-covered lane, his breath forming clouds as he made his way toward the vicarage. He had received word that the medical examiner had completed the preliminary report on Rory Hemsworth's death. The updated findings might narrow the culprit or complicate matters entirely. Miss Marple was already waiting when he arrived, seated in the vicar's front room with her knitting bag tucked beside her chair. She looked up as Graves entered, offering a mild smile. "Good evening, Inspector," she said gently. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged, removing his hat and scarf. "I believe we may now have more clarity." The vicar, Reverend Elwood, entered with a pot of tea, setting it on the small table between them. His usually cheerful demeanor was subdued. "More clarity," Miss Marple repeated softly, "or more confusion?" Graves paused before answering. "The medical report confirms that Rory was poisoned before the stabbing occurred." Reverend Elwood gasped softly. Miss Marple merely lowered her knitting needles, eyes thoughtful. "So the stabbing," she murmured, "may have been a secondary act, to ensure the poison succeeded or to disguise its use." Graves nodded grimly. "Precisely. And the poison, a concentrated tincture of nightshade, was likely ingested less than an hour before his death." The vicar's voice trembled. "Nightshade. But that grows wild near the old stone wall behind the church." "Yes," Graves replied, "which means anyone with botanical knowledge could have accessed it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered, not in surprise, but acknowledgement. Botany is a common knowledge in rural villages. Colds, teas, poultices. Many households collect herbs. "But," Graves said, leaning forward, "Mrs. Hargrave teaches an herbal craft class for the Women's Guild, and Mr. Hemsworth Sr. keeps a small greenhouse with medicinal plants behind their cottage. Sophie Tilling also studies plant identification in her school coursework." The vicar looked between them, bewildered. "But that implicates half the village." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "which is exactly why poison is so effective. It allows anyone to be suspected." There was a knock at the vicarage door, hurried, sharp. Reverend Elwood answered it, revealing Mrs. Hargrave herself, flushed, breathless from haste. Her eyes darted directly to Inspector Graves. "We must speak," she said, voice tight. "Now." Graves gestured for her to enter. She clasped her gloved hands so tightly the knuckles showed white. "I came because I have remembered something I did not think relevant before, but I fear now I should have told you immediately." Miss Marple watched her closely. "It's regarding the mayor," Mrs. Hargrave continued. "Yesterday, before the pageant rehearsal began, I saw him speaking with Rory. Not an ordinary conversation. No, it was tense, whispered but firm, and when Rory walked away, the mayor looked shaken." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Did you hear what was said?" Mrs. Hargrave hesitated. "Only one phrase. Rory said, 'I won't be silent about it any longer,' and he walked away." Miss Marple's knitting resumed, slow and steady. And the mayor? He looked terrified, she breathed, utterly terrified. Reverend Elwood sank into his chair. But what could the mayor possibly be hiding that Rory knew? Miss Marple cleared her throat lightly. Secrets, Reverend, are rarely singular. A person who knows one often knows others. Graves stood abruptly. I must speak with the mayor, immediately. Mrs. Hargrave exhaled shakily, as though relieved her burden had been lifted. Yet when she turned toward the door, Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in the woman's left hand. Not fear, something else, something closer to guilt or anxiety. Mrs. Hargrave, Miss Marple said softly, stopping her. One moment, if you will. The choir director paused. When Rory challenged your authority during rehearsals, Marple continued politely, you said you disliked his disregard for tradition. But I wonder, was that truly the reason? Mrs. Hargrave's composure wavered. What are you implying? Only that your reaction seemed far more emotional than one expects over a matter of pageant staging. Her jaw tightened. The boy reminded me of someone I lost. Is that satisfactory? Miss Marple's expression softened. Gently, sincerely. That must have been difficult for you. Mrs. Hargrave blinked. Her defensiveness faltered. She nodded once, and then left the vicarage quietly. Graves looked to Miss Marple. You don't believe she killed him? No, she replied, but she knows more than she realizes, or more than she wishes to admit. The mayor's house lay near the edge of the village, a stately building with ivy-covered walls and darkened windows. Graves and Miss Marple approached together, though one might expect the inspector to object, he did not. He had already learned the value of her presence. The door was answered not by the mayor, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Chudley, her eyes wide with fright. Oh, Inspector, thank goodness you've come. The mayor, he hasn't spoken in hours. He's in the study, just sitting. Won't move, won't answer. Graves stepped inside. The house was cold, unnaturally so, as though the hearth had gone unlit all day. The study door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the mayor sat in an armchair, staring into the fireplace, though no fire burned. His hands were clasped tightly together, and his expression was hollow. Mayor Pembroke, Graves said quietly, we need to ask you a few questions. The mayor did not look up. His voice was barely audible when he spoke. He told me, he whispered. Rory, he said he had proof. Proof of what, sir? Graves pressed. The mayor's voice cracked. That I falsified the charity accounts for the Christmas fund. I moved money, reallocated it. I meant to repay it. Truly, I did. But he found the ledger notes. Reverend Elwood, who had accompanied them, gasped softly. But I did not kill him, the mayor said, lifting haunted eyes at last. I swear it. I confronted him only to beg for time, and he refused. Miss Marple stepped forward. Not accusing, not comforting, observing. And were you aware, she asked gently, that someone else overheard your conversation? The mayor froze. There it was. Fear. But not shock, meaning he knew who. Miss Marple had seen enough. The puzzle was shifting, pieces rearranging, links revealing themselves, and someone very particular, was running out of time. The night settled thickly over St. Mildred's, a cold hush sweeping through empty streets. Snow continued to fall in slow, drifting flakes, blanketing the village in deceptive tranquility. Only the church bell tower rose stark and solemn against the dark sky, its stone walls frosted in white. Miss Marple, wrapped in her wool coat and carrying her knitting bag, stepped carefully along the narrow path to the parish hall. A lantern glowed softly inside. She had arranged for this meeting herself, quietly, discreetly, without informing Inspector Graves. Some matters, she knew, required gentler handling. Inside, the hall was dimly lit, chairs stacked neatly along the walls except for one table at the center. A pot of tea sat upon it, steam curling upward in lazy spirals. Miss Marple moved with slow, deliberate grace, setting down her bag and beginning to lay out her knitting work as though she had simply come for a peaceful evening stitch. She chose the seat facing the door and waited. She did not wait long. Footsteps approached, unsteady, halting, then firmer on the wood floor. Sophie Tilling emerged from the shadows of the corridor. Her face was pale, cheeks flushed as though she had run. Her eyes, which had once held youthful wonder, now glinted with a mixture of sorrow and something harder. "Miss Marple," she breathed. "You sent for me?" "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Do sit down. You must be chilled." She poured a cup of tea and slid it across the table. Sophie hesitated. "You think I killed him?" It was not a question. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "If I believed you capable of murder, my dear, I would not have invited you to tea." The girl's shoulders sagged, relief or exhaustion or both. She sat. Her hands clasped the teacup, but she did not drink. "I loved him," Sophie whispered. "I don't care what my mother says, or what anyone says. It was not childish infatuation." Miss Marple nodded. "No, I don't imagine it was." Sophie blinked rapidly. "But that doesn't matter now, does it? He's gone, and everyone is looking for someone to blame. First Mother, then Mrs. Hargrave, then the mayor. It's like the village wants someone to hate just to feel safe again." "People often do," Miss Marple agreed, softly. "Fear makes the kindest of us quite unkind." Sophie stared down into her tea. Miss Marple continued, her tone still gentle, still warm. "Sophie, I wonder if you might tell me something honest." Sophie swallowed. "What?" "Whether Rory confided anything in you during those last days. Something that troubled him. Something heavy." Sophie froze. Her silence was answer enough. "He did," Miss Marple said quietly. "Didn't he?" Sophie nodded once, throat tight. "He found something terrible, but he didn't want to tell me. He said it wasn't safe for me to know." "And did you press him?" "Yes," Sophie whispered. "He said it concerned someone respected in the village, someone everyone trusts, but he didn't tell me who." Miss Marple did not ask more. She had not expected names, only affirmation. Sophie's hand trembled around the teacup. "Why are you asking me this? You don't think I—" "No, dear," Miss Marple repeated softly. "But I do think you know who might have known about Rory's discovery. Someone who could have overheard. Someone close enough to you to notice your distress." Sophie's breath caught. There. The needle found the dropped stitch. She stood abruptly. I have to go." Miss Marple did not stop her. Instead, she called gently as Sophie reached the hall entrance. "Does your mother know you still wear the silver locket Rory gave you?" Sophie froze in place. Very slowly, her hand rose to her collarbone, where a small chain glimmered faintly against her blouse. She did not turn around when she whispered, "Please don't tell her." "I won't," Miss Marple assured. But Sophie had already fled into the night. Miss Marple sat alone only a few minutes before the next guest arrived. The door opened quietly, timidly, much unlike Sophie's frantic departure. Mrs. Tilling stepped inside, her cloak drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked weary, older than she had looked even the night before. "Miss Marple," she said weakly, "Sophie told me you wished to speak to me." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, gesturing to the chair Sophie had just vacated. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Mrs. Tilling sat slowly, like a woman bracing herself for a blow. "I know why you sent for me," she said softly. "The police suspect me, don't they? Everyone must think I killed him, to protect my daughter, to prevent her shame." Miss Marple studied her with gentle patience. "I believe you loved Sophie deeply, And love, Mrs. Tilling, can drive people to acts of fierce desperation. But I also believe that you do not lie easily, and that if you had killed Rory Hemsworth, your grief would look quite different from fear." Mrs. Tilling's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "But I was afraid. Afraid Sophie would lose herself. Afraid he was manipulating her. Afraid she would run off with him and ruin her future." "No mother wishes harm on her child," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Tilling lowered her face into her hands. "But I didn't kill him, I swear it." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Tilling looked up, shocked. "You, do?" "Yes, but someone else believed you might. And that, Mrs. Tilling, is far more telling." Mrs. Tilling's breath trembled. "Who?" Before Miss Marple answered, the door creaked again, soft, cautious footsteps entering the hall. They both turned. There, in the doorway, stood Mr. Hemsworth, Rory's father. His face was no longer grief-stricken. It was hollow, cold, still. Miss Marple did not rise. She did not startle. She merely began knitting again, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Mr. Hemsworth," she said calmly, "I expected you might join us." Mrs. Tilling inhaled sharply. "You—" He stepped forward, expression carved in stone. "You shouldn't have come here alone," Mrs. Tilling whispered, shrinking back. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, steady, unshaken. "Oh no," she said gently. "I am not alone. I spoke with Inspector Graves before coming. He's waiting just outside." Mr. Hemsworth stiffened. The air shifted. The trap had sprung. Miss Marple looked up at him, not accusing, not triumphant, simply knowing. "You loved your son," she said. "But love can curdle, can it not? Especially when one learns that the child they cherished has discovered something dreadful about them." His jaw clenched. Mrs. Tilling stared between them, horrified. Miss Marple continued, her voice almost whisper-soft. "Rory did not stumble upon the mayor's misdeed by accident. He found something else, something older, something buried in your past, and he was going to reveal it." The room fell silent. Snow continued falling beyond the window, slow, soft, unforgiving. The hall was hushed. Outside, the snow fell steadily, muffling every sound of the village, but inside, tension thrummed like a taut wire. Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting needles clicking ever so softly, while Mrs. Tilling clutched the edge of her chair, pale and trembling. Mr. Hemsworth, Rory's father, stood rigid in the center of the room, hands clenched at his sides, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. "Now," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle, measured, but carrying a weight that made the others still their breathing. "I think it is time we spoke frankly. Every secret has its place, every misstep its reason, and every act, however carefully concealed, leaves a mark." She paused, letting the silence draw attention to the faint tremor of Mr. Hemsworth's hands. He had not moved, not even a fraction, but his eyes, dark, cautious, flickered once toward the knitting needles before returning to her calm gaze. Rory Hemsworth was, as you all know, an observant, careful young man, Miss Marple continued. He noticed what many did not. He understood human behavior, perhaps better than some adults who thought themselves discreet, and because of that understanding, he uncovered a truth some preferred to remain hidden. Mrs. Tilling gasped softly. Her eyes searched Miss Marple's for reassurance, but there was none. Only certainty. "The letters sent anonymously," Miss Marple went on. "The subtle misplacement of props during the pageant, the tiny warning note burned partially in the hall, all of these were designed to protect a secret. But not all the players involved were aware of their significance. Some were merely observers, caught in the ripples of another scheme." She rose slowly, placing her knitting aside. Her hands folded calmly in front of her. Let us recall the day of the pageant itself. Rory was performing his role with cheer, yet his attention strayed, not toward misbehaving children, not toward missed cues, but toward one adult in particular. He watched, he observed. And in that observation, he discovered the truth of what had occurred months before. In a moment, no one suspected. Her gaze settled on Mr. Hemsworth. You, sir, were not simply grieving a minor grievance when the argument over Sophie occurred. You were concerned, weren't you, that Rory might uncover your secret? Mr. Hemsworth shifted slightly, though he maintained his rigid posture. He did not speak. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly, and she continued, almost as though speaking to a child. You attempted to control the situation delicately, persuading Rory not to speak, not because you wished him harm, but because you feared exposure. And yet, exposure came in another form. Mrs. Tilling's hand flew to her mouth. My God, it wasn't him, she whispered. No, my dear, Miss Marple replied. The act was deliberate, but not by the hands you suspect. She turned slowly, addressing the room at large. The culprit is someone who had access, opportunity, and motive. Someone who knew that Rory's discovery would disrupt plans, reveal truths inconvenient to themselves, or perhaps threaten their own carefully maintained reputation. Her gaze rested upon a figure in the doorway, the choir director, Mrs. Hargrave. The woman's face had grown pale, her composure wavering ever so slightly. You, Miss Marple said gently, used your knowledge of herbs, your access to the stage, and the confidence of a trusted adult to administer the poison. Nightshade, delivered in tea, concealed beneath ordinary cordial. A simple act, unnoticed because the manner of its execution was mundane. Mrs. Hargrave's lips parted, as if to protest, but no words emerged. Her hands shook slightly at her sides, betraying the calm she had attempted to project. You misdirected suspicion cleverly, Miss Marple continued. The misaligned props, the small alterations during rehearsals, even the whispered conversations that Sophie overheard, they were all intended to create confusion, to make it appear that someone else might bear responsibility, but the signs, the subtle markers, were never hidden from those who truly observe. Miss Marple lifted the small fragment of the burned note from her pocket, holding it so that everyone could see the faint pencil marks. This note, partially burned, was left deliberately, a warning perhaps to oneself, perhaps as a test. But it also confirms method. Only someone familiar with both the stage and Rory's routine could have left it and ensured it would be discovered. Mrs. Hargrave finally drew a trembling breath. I didn't mean. I only wanted him to stop. He was going to ruin everything I had worked for, the pageant, the choir, the traditions. I only wanted him to listen. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, but threats and intentions, while sometimes understandable, cannot justify murder. Your actions, though perhaps provoked by fear, were deliberate. You administered the poison, knowing the consequences. The stabbing was secondary, a distraction, an effort to mask the first act. The room was silent now, the village's collective tension at its peak. Even Mr. Hemsworth and Mrs. Tilling had ceased moving, their faces pale, minds trying to process what had been revealed. Inspector Graves finally stepped forward, his face tight with professional restraint. Mrs. Hargrave, you are under arrest for the murder of Rory Hemsworth, he said, his voice firm. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in a court of law. The choir director's hands fell to her sides. She nodded slowly, almost in resignation. I understand, she whispered. Her composure shattered completely as she sank into the nearest chair, head bowed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, retrieved her knitting, resuming her work with calm precision. It is always surprising, she said softly, almost to herself, how the ordinary gestures of life conceal extraordinary truths. Fear, love, ambition, resentment, They leave footprints if one knows where to look. Mrs. Tilling exhaled, shivering slightly, though relief and horror mingled in her expression. I never imagined—" Miss Marple placed a hand gently over hers. "No one does, my dear. It is the hidden complexities of human nature that create the most unexpected outcomes." Outside, the snow fell in silence, masking the tracks of those who had moved hastily through the village in the days preceding. Inside, the hall felt heavier, burdened by revelations long overdue. Yet for Miss Marple, there was calm. The puzzle had been unraveled. Not with confrontation, not with force, but with careful observation, patience, and the subtle understanding of human behavior. Even in St. Mildred's, where the ordinary had been shattered by tragedy, the ordinary would soon resume. The villagers would whisper, speculate, and mourn. But the truth had been revealed, and Miss Marple, quietly tucking her knitting into her bag, reflected, as always, on the fragile, intricate patterns that guided people to both joy and despair. The Christmas pageant had gone silent, but its lessons, like the snow, would linger, leaving a mark impossible to ignore.